Welcome back to our next episode with Michael Horner. And we've been looking at what the track record of Christianity in history is and covering both positive and negative. I'm your co-host, Kirk Durston. And welcome back, Michael Horner. How are you doing?
Doing good, Kirk. Looking forward to today's topic. It's
Yeah.
a it's a difficult one.
Yeah, it is. Now, in general, the track record of history shows that the impact of authentic Christianity on history has been remarkably positive, contrary to the urban myths that we're seeing. But as you have pointed out, and as we've already started to discuss, it hasn't all been good. There have been negative aspects, negative impacts, things like the Crusades, which we discussed last episode, and the Inquisition is another one. And so today we're going to look at the Inquisition and just take a little bit closer look at that. So what have you got to say about that, Michael?
Well, there really wasn't just one Inquisition. Most historians talk about it in plural terms now, Inquisitions. But the whole idea just comes from the idea of being inquisitive. And there was a Roman method of dealing with gathering information from people and from the surrounding neighborhood or the surrounding network of the people in question, that was given a name that is essentially Inquisition in English, and the church picked up on this because the church had a strong connection to the Roman Empire from which it grew out of course, and was in the process of changing, but still a lot of Roman culture influenced the way the church functioned. And so the Inquisition was kind of founded on the principle that heresy cannot be allowed to flourish. I mean, I've used the word flourish a lot in this series already. We're talking about does Christianity, is it helpful or harmful for human flourishing? Well, people were concerned about human flourishing back then too, and the idea was that heresy was very harmful to human flourishing. This is how people thought in the Middle Ages, and because it
What do you
endangered.
mean by heresy?
Heresy here is referring to going contrary to the teachings of the church, which would probably include the teachings of Jesus and the Bible, but may also include additional teachings that had been added, and what would be emphasized as heresy at a particular time might be slightly different depending on
Mm-hmm.
what people are thinking or focusing on at a certain time. But the idea was heresy endangers the soul being the core of who you are, the immaterial part of you. And it endangers that soul both now, here and now, and potentially for all eternity, because the soul lives for all eternity. And so heresy is really dangerous if that's what it does. And so, in their view, it would make no more sense to be tolerant of heresy than it would to be tolerant of murder or genocide. And the danger is not just to the individual. We're going to see the key part of this is it's the danger to the broader collective. Now, most of us think of torture chambers, I think, when the word Inquisitions come up. And that's the first thing that comes to my mind, and it makes me very squeamish. I mean, what I have sort of heard about the Inquisitions growing up just makes my skin crawl, right? And unfortunately, there's some truth to it. But as we've seen in the other examples of negative impact of Christians, there's exaggerations that have taken place, and we have to factor that into our discussion today. There's a Monty Python sketch about Inquisitions. I mean, it's amazing how they were able to make some pretty funny sketches about things like the Crusades and the Inquisition and so on. And John Dixon, the historian, Australian historian, says with this classic Monty Python sketch, we reach the zenith of criticism of the late medieval church practice. He says, when something passes from outrage, disdain, and denunciation to simple jest on national TV, you know the process of cultural critique is complete. I mean, something that's reached that point, this is clearly moved from being, oh, this is horrible, to just ridicule. We're just ridiculing this now. And that's what's happened with the Inquisition. You couldn't have done a comedy sketch like that in the 18th or 19th centuries, he says, because the memory of the pain of these Inquisitions throughout Europe was still raw. Like we have a saying now, too soon? Someone tells a joke and it's just a little bit too soon after something bad has happened. Too soon? Yeah, it was too soon. That would have been too soon for jokes about the Inquisition, but 20th century, 21st century was not. And Dixon says during the 18th and 19th centuries, there's this vast amount of critical literature developed. This is part of this Enlightenment narrative, Enlightenment project that I've been talking about. And it includes philosophical critiques, theological histories, even the whole idea of a Gothic novel, all condemning the Dark Ages, and in particular the Inquisition, which is kind of like the poster boy of the Dark Ages, really, or the alleged Dark Ages, as we've seen. And so Dixon says that one Australian journalist that he knows actually claims that millions of secular martyrs met their cruel deaths in the Inquisition. And unfortunately, a lot of people believe that, but it's not completely true. 25 years ago, you still had some encyclopedias like the Columbia Encyclopedia saying torture of the accused soon became customary and notorious, and most trials resulted in a verdict of guilty. And it was because of views like this that the popular historian of the 20th century, Will Durant, informed several generations of readers that we must rank the Inquisition as among the darkest blots on the record of mankind, revealing a ferocity unknown in any beast. So I think that paints a pretty accurate picture of the Enlightenment narrative that we've all come across in one way or another, if we're adults now in our culture. But this is an exaggerated, hyperbolic Enlightenment narrative, which was, like many of these exaggerated stories of the alleged Dark Ages, was picked up from earlier Protestant inflations of the brutality and inflation of the numbers of deaths involved. And so actually, I just before we got on here, I thought I would check. I wonder what Wikipedia is saying about this. Not because I see Wikipedia as a trustworthy source, I don't, but it does tell you a little bit about where culture's at. And if Wikipedia has changed their view on this, that might give us some information. And so here's what Wikipedia says about the Inquisitions. Despite what is popularly believed, the cases in which torture was used during the inquisitorial processes were rare. And this is what I have found in my research too, since it was considered to be ineffective in obtaining evidence. And I mean, the Catholic Church, they weren't stupid. They realized that you're not going to get good evidence from torture like most people realize now. People are going to tell you whatever you want to hear to get out of it. In addition, in the vast majority of cases, display of torture instruments mainly had the purpose of intimidation of the accused, their use being much more the exception than the norm. And in the next paragraph, they say, in the words of a historian, Helen Merrill Carrell, quote, the common view of the medieval justice system as cruel and based on torture and execution is often unfair and inaccurate, end of quote. And as the historian Nigel Townsend wrote, quote, the sinister torture chambers, equipped with cogwheels, bone-crushing contraptions, shackles, and other terrifying mechanisms, only existed in the imagination of their detractors. So it looks like Wikipedia has sort of caught up with what the historian Rodney Stark was writing a couple of decades ago. Stark says the standard account of the Spanish Inquisition is mostly a pack of lies, invented and spread by English and Dutch propagandists in the 16th century during the wars with Spain, and repeated ever after by the malicious or misled historians eager to sustain an image of Spain as a nation of fanatical bigots. So you see, it wasn't even just religious, there was political tension involved here too that led to the exaggerations.
Well,
And
that's
so,
true. I know in my conversations over the years, if people are going to talk about, if you say the word Inquisition, the first thing that comes to mind, and maybe it's thanks to Monty Python, I don't know, but the Spanish Inquisition, that is the poster boy for Inquisitions, or at least what's uppermost in people's minds.
correct.
And yet what you're showing here is that it's actually got some political motivation for promoting, back in a few centuries ago, for promoting this bad attitude towards Spain.
Yes, yeah. As it grew over the years, yeah. I mean, it just started out as a church thing to find heretical teaching that was causing harm in the individuals and in a local community. But given human nature, it did develop into something much worse. Don't misunderstand me. If you're a viewer here and you haven't heard some of our other stuff, I'm not trying to explain away and say there was nothing wrong done that we call the Inquisition. No, there was some bad done, seriously. But my first point is that there's a lot of exaggeration that's gone on here. And one of the key things that has helped us is that in the last 50 years, the archives of the relevant European governments and church institutions were opened up to researchers. So that's not until just the last 50 years ago or so. So prior to that, people were basing their history of the Inquisitions mostly on speculation and these hyperbolic exaggerations that were being spread around for religious and political, to score religious and political points, basically. The Vatican archives, for example, were made public just in 1998. But now we have very careful records. In fact, we know the numbers. We have careful records of 44,674 cases heard by the two main Inquisitions between the years 1540 and 1700. That's remarkable. Each case, we have the exact records. And at the time these records were written, they were so secret, there was no reason for the clerks to have misrepresented the actual proceedings, because they're afraid that's going to get out to the public, kind of thing. Like we hear nowadays, governments redact everything because they're afraid it's going to get out. What was actually said behind closed doors is going to get out to the public. Well, there was no concern about that at all, because this was all kept so secret. Never anticipated it would ever be made public, and it wasn't until just very recently. And so Rodney Stark, the sociologist and historian, says the results are solidly undeniable that we have from these records that go right back to the time of the events. So Stark says, astonishing as it may seem, the new historians of the Inquisition, based on the new information we have, revealed that in contrast with the secular courts all across Europe, the Spanish Inquisition was a consistent force for justice, restraint, due process, and enlightenment. Wow. I mean, that couldn't be more opposite than the narrative we've heard. This is not to say that it was perfect, but it was not what we've been told.
Yeah, and so the point here is that if you just take the Spanish Inquisition by itself, without comparing it to, say, the secular courts and political systems, then it's not looking the same as what we would expect today. However, if you do compare it with secular court systems of the day, then it looks actually quite good, at least better than what you got in the secular society with the courts and political justice systems.
You always have to ask the question, compared to what?
Yeah.
Something, good or bad compared to what? Now, how did the process work in Inquisition? They're trying to find false teaching that they sincerely believe is harmful to the individual and the community. And so when they found such, the idea was to restore these people. They viewed themselves as doctors more than anything else. And in order to restore them, they would often give the people some sort of penance that they had to do. Say a bunch of prayers, go on a pilgrimage, maybe a temporary time in prison, or very common, wearing of a special cross for a period of time, sometimes a long period of time, even for life. What about death? Well, the few who were sentenced to death by the Spanish Inquisition usually were repeat offenders who would not repent. I mean, we're dealing with that in our culture nowadays as well. How do you deal with repeat offenders, right? You keep putting them back out in the street when they continue to offend again and again and again. And we have sort of an empathetic view that, well, no, these are people still with dignity and they must be treated and their rights respected, they must be treated well. On the other hand, society has to be protected. And so there's always that tension going on. But with the Inquisition, it was only repeat offenders who refused to change their views, refused to repent, who were ever sentenced to death. And then those who resolutely refused to stop advocating their heresy were declared guilty, and they were handed over to the state authorities for sentencing, because the state authorities saw heretics as traitors to good order, and they eagerly executed them. And this is where burning at the stake took place. It was state authorities who often used burning at the stake to kill people.
Well, that's an important point, which I don't think I realized before, is that it's not just the church, but the church handing to the state. So the state is also complicit in actually carrying out whatever sentence the state deems appropriate, in this case, burning at the stake. So it's important, I think, to make that distinction here, or maybe not a distinction, observation, that we can't attribute everything that happened during the Inquisition to just the church, but also to the state when it came to those who were repeat offenders.
Right. Now, the vast majority of cases in the Inquisition result in little or no consequences. But just think, the threat of being handed over to the authorities who had the power to do that, to burn you at the stake, makes the type of coercion involved still pretty harmful, pretty serious, something we would never put up with today. That's not persuasion by words. That's persuasion by severe threat of violence. and that's a violation. I think something the church shouldn't have been doing. And so the state rulers frequently saw heresy as a cancer to social cohesion. And what do you do with cancer? You cut it out. And it needs to be mercilessly cut out. But church inquisitors normally saw themselves, this is what these new primary documents reveal, as doctors sent to heal sick heretics and their communities. And it's widely agreed that prisons operated by the Inquisition were by far the most comfortable and humane in Europe. I mean, that just pause after that sentence for a moment. The prisons operated by the Inquisition were the most comfortable and humane prisons in all of Europe. And here's an anecdote that kind of shows that. There were instances, more than one, of criminals in Spain purposely blaspheming so that they would be transferred to an Inquisition's prison. So they're in jail already, the state's prison, and they purposely blaspheme so that they get transferred to an Inquisition's prisons because everybody knows they were a lot nicer. So, I mean, we could go on for a long time about the Inquisitions, and I do not want to make light of this or make little of it. It still makes me squeamish. But contrary to the Black Legend, which is a label that's been given the Enlightenment narrative about this whole thing, the Inquisition made little use of the stake. It seldom tortured anyone, and it maintained unusually decent prisons, Rodney Stark tells us. But still, horrible atrocities did take place. And that shows how bad the secular courts were. But just the atrocities that did take place through the church are just nowhere near the numbers of the Enlightenment narrative that we've been told. So Glenn Scrivener, who I've mentioned before, is a British thinker who's written a book called The Air We Breathe. He says, sober-minded historical research, and there are very careful records to consult, puts the death toll at about 2,000 executions for the notorious 50 years under Tomás de Torquemada and his protégés. So that's between the years 1480 and 1530. This is the beginnings of the Inquisition, and they were the worst of it. So the first 50 years, about 2,000 executions. In the following 300 years, there were an additional 3,000 executions. Now, Scrivener says, compare even the worst of Torquemada's time. Tomás de Torquemada was kind of the poster boy of the Inquisition. So the worst of his time, 2,000 executions in 50 years. You compare that with the last 45 to 50 years of state executions in the United States. And it's about the same numbers. It's about the same numbers of people killed through the death penalty in the United States or a similar period of time. Let's make another comparison. Let's compare the numbers of the Inquisition with the French Reign of Terror. It's part of the French Revolution. With this French Reign of Terror, during the Age of the Enlightenment, that's the French Revolution took place in the Age of the Enlightenment period, where reason was supposed to be in charge. And in only 9 months following the storm of the Bastille in 1789, 17,000 were executed in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The key words in the French Revolution. 17,000 in 9 months. How about the Red Terror of the Russian Revolution in 1917? Well, the best estimates set the probable number of executions at about 100,000 in 1917, following the Russian Revolution. This is an execution rate 1,400 times that of the Spanish Inquisition. So we're putting things into perspective here. So what are the actual numbers? Okay. So the actual numbers of the Inquisitions turn out to be between 5 and 6,000 people over a 350-year period, which works out to 18 per year. Not millions, not 300,000, not 100,000, like most of the exaggerated accounts.
Well,
But
what's interesting here? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Michael.
no, actually, this is a good time for you to jump in.
Yeah, what I find interesting is in my experience in university campuses across Canada and elsewhere, the Inquisition is a very common objection raised or accusation against, in favor of the argument that Christianity has a bad track record. But these other examples that you gave me, where you have a very secular, in fact, the Russian Revolution was atheism was a core belief, and in Russian communism, French Reign of Terror was also what we would call very secular. But I don't think I've ever once heard students argue about the poor track record of, let's say, a secular society by pointing out the French Reign of Terror or the Red Terror of the Russian Revolution. There's either a pretty big double standard here, or else it's probably also substantially because of ignorance. It's just that we hear a lot about the Inquisition by secularists, but the secularists say very little about these other examples you gave, which are considerably worse. Not that justifies the Inquisition at all, and I think you're going to make that
Correct.
point, or you are making that point.
But there does seem to be, you're right, a bit of a double standard here. I mean, I think the skeptic, the sort of the anti-religious, the atheist are motivated, just like all people with human nature are, to make their enemies look worse, and they've done so in the narrative that's come out that kind of paints religion as the only real source or the worst source of violence and killing, and they just ignore what happened under communism in the 20th century, and in fact they try to explain it away that atheism has nothing to do with it, which I think is laughable. And it may seem similar to what we're doing, because we're even though we are admitting horrible atrocities have taken place, one of our points is that it's not representative of the teachings of Jesus and his early followers. And the atheists do try to make a similar argument. They do try to say communism doesn't represent accurately, atheism. But I don't think that argument actually works. Whereas I think ours is correct. These types of behaviors do not represent the teachings of Jesus, and when someone is doing them, they are acting in a way that is contrary, in contradiction to the teachings of Jesus and his early followers. So let's continue on about that point. These 5,000 deaths, 3,000 to 5,000 deaths that have taken place under the Inquisition are a dark stain on the history of the church. I'll come right out and admit that. Each one is a sin against the person killed, as well as a crime against freedom of conscience. And it's persuasion that we should be using. Persuasion through words, persuasion through coercion or threat of force. It's not power, ought to be the means by which influence is spread. So, and every death in the name of Christianity is an assault on that, and it's wrong, it's dark. But then Scrivener asks the point, but then why do we recoil so instinctively from such an imposition of force? And one of Scrivener's themes is the crooked line testifies to the straight. We recognize that there's something crooked going on here compared to the straight line, which is the teachings of Jesus. And our culture has been so strongly influenced by that we begin to impose that back and say, no, these things were wrong. It's wrong to impose your views on others, whether the views you prize involve Christianity or freedom, democracy, the workers' paradise, or a Muslim caliphate. But this is wrong because we have a sense of what is right. Scrivener says, we believe that there's a fundamental difference between words and violence. We believe that force is not the way to extend your influence, but persuasion is. And where do we get these notions? It's Jesus who taught us to put away your sword in Matthew 26. It's Paul who instead urged Christians to use the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. Wickedly, the Inquisition used harsh means to bring about coercion. But if we believe in gentle means, it's the unique foundation of Christianity which will give best support. So Dixon kind of sums this up. He says, look, 18 per year over 350 years, that's still way too many. This is a blight on church history. And it was right that Pope John Paul II publicly apologized for them on March 12th, 2000, in a public ceremony. Still, Dixon, by the way, Dixon doesn't pull any punches about the bad done by Christians. That's why his book is entitled Bullies and Saints. And he points out both types of behavior. But he says, still, in a fair-minded history of violence, from the Middle Ages to today, the Inquisitions would not even make the top 10. Now, put that beside the Enlightenment narrative. And he says, and the Spanish Inquisition would hardly register a blip on the radar of a history of human violence. So we're always compared to what? Well, compared to the whole history of humankind, Spanish Inquisition would hardly be a blip compared to what else has happened. And yet, it seems to stand out. He uses the phrase looms larger in the modern mind than most other examples of cruelty in history. And so
it seems,
I just want to say that's part of us trying to set the record straight here.
yeah. Well, it seems that we actually have to compare three things, not just two. And you've done this, although maybe I want to explicate it just a bit more. We have to compare what these blights on church history, we have to look at that. But then we have to compare it with, well, what did secular society, how does that compare with secular society? And you've just underscored that, yeah, it's inexcusable what was done during the Spanish Inquisition, even when you factor out all the exaggeration, it's still inexcusable. But a blip in comparison to secular society. But there's something else we need to compare this to as well. And that is, we need to compare it to the teachings of Jesus. So we got to look at each one of these blights in the history of the church and compare them with those two things. One is, well, how does secular society fare? And we find that, and I know in my own research as well, especially looking through the work of Rudolf Rummel at the University of Hawaii, that, wow, if you want to see unrestrained atrocities that make everything else relatively minor by comparison, you look at those societies that had as a core belief atheism. We're talking specifically, and you've mentioned Russian communism, for example. There are other examples, but it still does not justify these things it does not justify these things. But when we look at the teachings of Jesus, which is you have to look at Jesus as to what defines authentic, true Christianity. You can see that there is a marked difference between these blights on the church in history and what Jesus actually taught. And that really he was very specific, even back then, making a very clear distinction whenever the religious leaders departed from what God actually wants and what God actually teaches. So this is not a new comparison that we're making. It's not something just a priori, or not a priori, but just ad hoc mentioning to kind of ease this. No, it's been going on for 2,000 years by Jesus Christ, even by Jesus Christ himself, to point out you need to be clear on what he teaches versus what, say, the church does or what secular society does.
Exactly right. Thank you for summing that up. And so we're trying to answer the question, is Christianity helpful or harmful for human flourishing? Do the Inquisitions prove the case that Christianity is harmful? No, it proves that some Christians have done some terrible, harmful things, but in doing so, they were acting contrary to the teachings of Jesus. And teaching of Jesus is what you look to for, as you said, what authentic Christianity is. And so it doesn't justify the conclusion that authentic Christianity is harmful. And I really want our world to rethink that assumption, because I honestly think our world maybe, well, is sawing off the branch that we're sitting on. Our Western culture has benefited so much from the teachings of Jesus. It's been a slow and gradual change that maybe happened a lot slower than we think it should happen if a God is actually behind it. But as we've mentioned before, slow and gradual might be the only way to get permanent change. Because if you don't do it slow and gradual, then you've got to take away people's freedom, and then people are acting like they've been converted on the outside when they really haven't changed at all on the inside. Real change probably takes more time, and I think that's the method of Jesus and God's plan, that people are changed at the heart level, and in that way a culture is changed slowly and gradually. And our Western culture now has benefited greatly, and that's been the point of what we've been trying to talk about here. And so the Enlightenment narrative that has been picked up, and it's been developed even further now, because I mean that goes back 250 years, but even now it's been picked up by other groups and added to, and it still has that core. They say religion is harmful, but they really mean Christianity in the West for the most part.
Yeah,
Right?
they don't usually speak against the other
Yeah.
ones.
And um, if the fruit of Christianity is going to remain, it's not going to remain very long without the root. And the Enlightenment project is a whole project of trying to have the fruit of Christianity, but believing we can have it without the root. Saying, yeah, we can take away the dogma, we can take away the religious underpinnings, and it's going to last. Well, it's lasting a bit, but it's fading. And Os Guinness, Christian thinker, says we're like flowers have been uprooted, and the flowers aren't going to last very long. And it's interesting in a panel discussion between Guinness, Jordan Peterson, and I'm not going to get this woman's name right. She's a Muslim woman, I think Iranian woman, who converted out of Islam to the new atheism and is now seemingly converted to Christianity. She kind of changed Os Guinness's metaphor and says, well, it's kind of like, it's not like flowers that have been uprooted, but the Christian teaching is kind of like seeds that need to be replanted, and we can still replant them. That's a more hopeful way of looking at it. They're still making the same point that what is alive now or semi-alive now is fading, and something needs
I
to
think
be
we
done.
can I think we can see that in our laws. A friend of mine who's a police officer recently retired, and he said, in our society, by the way, it has consistently cut itself off from the Judeo-Christian ethic, from anything to do with Christianity, from God. But along with that, he said when he retired, he had 3 times as many laws to enforce as he did when he joined 30 years earlier.
Mm.
And with the abandonment of the actual teachings of Jesus and implementing them in our lives, there's still a problem of how people behave. And so the replacement is laws and yet more laws to try and make people behave and force them to behave. And this we have, instead of to the Judeo-Christian ethic, it's replaced with a rapidly growing set of laws to try and enforce and make people behave.
Yeah, and laws themselves won't get the end result of changing the inner person. They're needed.
No.
They're needed to protect society. But if you want ultimate flourishing, you need to change people at the heart level as well. So the Inquisitions, they usually stand out as kind of number one in people's minds. It makes me squeamish even to think about what was done. The numbers are exaggerated, though. And compared to what's been done in the rest of history, compared to what's been done even in recent history by non-religious and non-Christian people, the Inquisition is not as big as it's bigger in our minds than it ought to be, as bad as it was. Now, there's another part of the Inquisition that we're going to get to next time, and that has to do with science and Galileo, because that's often held up as a poster boy for the evils of the Inquisition. And the Galileo story is really, really interesting when you look into it. So that'll be our next topic.
Well, I'll look forward to that, Michael, and thanks for going over this today. I think it's really helped me get a more accurate view of what went on in the past with regard to the Inquisition. And I'll be looking
My
forward
pleasure.
to this Galileo bit next
All right.
episode.
Thanks, Kurt.
Bye. Bye for now.